Disney has been a part of my life since I was very young. My mom has been a huge fan of it since she was a kid, and as I've mentioned before, she passed that on to me. While I may not be in love with the old live-action shows or the older movies as much as she was, I absolutely adore the theme parks, with some cavettes. And the Disney afternoon and the Renaissance era of movies and beyond are all classics to me and that I still rewatch. That isn't to mention many of the spin-offs that Disney was involved with in one way or another. Now, I could go on and gush for hours about those, but really I just wanted to focus on one very specific thing that Disney combined with, and that was video games, and very specifically, Sega. These were two of my biggest influences growing up, and to see them together was huge for me. Sega and Disney have a slightly more connected history than you might expect, and some of the inner workings of their video game deals shaped the course of things for both Disney and Sega alike. One of the few non-video game collaborations that Sega and Disney had was Sega having a large section of Innoventions, the recently rebranded Communicore exhibit area in Epcot. This place was basically a year-round E3 CES booth that you could visit and see all of the newest Sega games, hardware, and more. Not a lot of footage of this exists anymore since it's been gone for years, but thanks to Martin Vids, an awesome Disney World archival YouTube channel, I'm able to show you just a slice of how cool this place was. I remember having to be dragged away the first and really only time I got to go to the booth. Specifically, I was playing Ren Stimpy's Invention of all games. However, this was one of the few cases of them working outside of it, and most of the time when they collaborated, it was in the realm of video games. So, given all the amazing titles Sega did with Disney, from the Master System to the Dreamcast and beyond, I wanted to do a little retrospective. Part history, part review, and part personal recollection. I'll be covering every Disney game that involved Sega in some capacity, whether they developed, or only published, or even just came out on a Sega console. Of course, to begin with, to quote Walt himself, it all started with a mouse. Disney's first game on a Sega console is one of its most fondly remembered, and our first subject, the Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse. Now, this game is generally considered to be a classic, although you'd be surprised how many people leave these off the best of Sega Genesis list or anything like that. For some reason, it doesn't get the pedigree that a lot of other Sega-developed titles in the system do. And to be fair, at the time of its release in 1990, it was considered groundbreaking, and generally speaking was one of Sega's flagship titles before Sonic the Hedgehog came along. Castle of Illusion was released on November 20th, 1990, and was released worldwide over the next 2 days. At the time of its release, most video game outlets worldwide gave the game fantastic scores, with 8s and 9s coming from outlets like Electronic Gaming Monthly, GamePro, Famitsu, and Computer and Video Games. It sold well, had ports, sequels, and spin-offs, and is fondly remembered by gamers from the era. The project was part of Sega AM7, who were responsible for the Alex Kidd and Phantasy Star series, among many console ports of Sega arcade titles, among much more. The team was made up of director Emiko Yamamoto, artist Takashi Yuda, designer Yoshio Yoshida, and composer Shigenori Kamiya, along with a team of 7 extra programmers and artists. Castle of Illusion is a very simple story. Mickey and Minnie are having a grand time in Vera City, while the witch Mizrabel watches in jealousy. On this particular day, she has decided to strike and steal Minnie away and take her to the Castle of Illusion. Here, she will basically switch places with Minnie, and Mickey needs to find the 7 gems of the rainbow in order to face her and rescue his love. From here, you'll enter the castle's many doors, taking you to all kinds of different worlds, each housing one of the gems. Each level, while not being based on any Disney properties, invokes the feelings of one, and the new art truly matches the style of the many Disney cartoons and movies. One of the more obvious answers to this is the toy level, which is very inspired by Babes in Toyland, a live-action movie from 1961 by the Disney Company. Not only does each level have a completely unique look, but each also has its own unique gimmicks, so at no point does the platforming ever feel too repetitive. The first level takes place in a forest, with enemies that invoke the art of Disney's Silly Symphony, a set of cartoons done by the company that usually had musical accompaniment throughout the runtime. The first part allows you to get accustomed to the jumping controls and figure out how using your bounce will be an essential asset throughout the game. One of the first things that struck me as a kid, compared to a Mario or Sonic, is that each level is like one long world or act in their respective games. However, instead of just a break at each zone, Each level flows into each other, making the journey feel more epic and the game feel longer, even if it wasn't. It felt grander than those games, in its own way. The transition from the forest to the inner forest felt like two completely different levels that made sense flowing from one into the other. Then, when you come out into the dark forest, and it transitions well again with a really cool element from going to day to night. It gives you a sense of ease as the creepy music takes over. All three of these sections also focus on different styles of platforming or exploration, which forces a slightly different approach to each. Finally, you reach the first boss. Sadly, this isn't very creative or particularly memorable, but the boss theme is fantastic. It makes the battle more enjoyable, but as you'll realize, Castle of Illusion's strong suit is in boss battles, and it's one of the few areas where the game could have seen a little bit of improvement. The second aforementioned toy level feels immediately different. You see the exit very early on, so you know you'll need to do something in order to make it appear, since the door is currently missing. This stage focuses on vertical scrolling as opposed to the horizontal scrolling of the last stage, and enemy obstacles become more of a hazard. What's really cool is, once you reach the top, the level gives you not only a quick way back down as to not kill the pace, but basically turns it into a bonus minigame, trying to collect diamonds as you scurry down the sloped ramps. The next part doesn't really involve anything crazy new, but involves lots of new enemies and different types of platforming traps in order to keep you on your toes and teach you new things. The next part introduces the flip mechanic, which is a gimmick that blew my mind as a kid. It doesn't really use the concept to the degree that the cult classic Metal Storm on the NES does, but it was a cool concept at the time that challenged you on the fly, and I hadn't seen it at that point. It's the only time they ever use it, but it's still neat. Finally, you reach the boss, which again is simple and nothing special, but it's a bit tougher than the first boss, and shows that the game won't be a total cakewalk. The third level has a pretty boring opening. The backdrop is beautiful, but it's mostly another maze-like section where you're just looking to get to the exit as quickly as possible with just a few different paths. It tends to be a bit boring, and it's not very difficult or long, and it just comes off as kind of fillerish. However, once you make it back into the next section, you end up in some ruins. And not only does the music pick back up, but the platforming starts to get really tricky, with constant waterfalls obscuring your vision and giant blasts of water coming down upon you, forcing a lot of patience in your jumps. The next part of the ruins has constant water rising up and down from the bottom, making speed a much bigger factor, and making one small mistake can send you going back, and taking damage. Again, this section feels very different from other sections of the level in the game. The boss in this section is very underwhelming, consisting of a few enemies popping out of stones one at a time, all with the same kind of pattern, so once you've hit one of them, you'll know how to do the last of them. Defeat them all, and you'll move on to the next level. Next, a staircase appears in front of Mickey, which will bring you to the second floor of the castle and the second half of the game, where you start to explore the castle itself. The first level seems much shorter. You're in the study room for a moment, then enter a milk jug into a world of sweets. You do a bit of platforming, and boom, fourth gem. They have now split the levels into two distinct parts, something I kinda disliked as it makes things seem less grand, but it's not a big deal. You'll now return to the study and explore more of it, with some solid platforming and cute graphical flourishes. You'll also find teacups that you can go into that will give you small water sections that are basically small bonus games, and they also act as checkpoints. Once you've reached the next milk jug, you'll once again end up in a land of sweets to fight the Licorice Dragon. Yes, that design is based off licorice, a design Takashi came up with after some had been sent from the American office as a gift, and unlike most of his cohorts, he took a liking to it, which is basically just a fun fact. The boss takes a few more hits than usual, and it's one of the better fights, but it's still simple and shouldn't take you too long, especially if you're stocked up on apples to throw at him. The final level puts you in the castle itself, leading up to the tower in which Minnie is being held. This section has traps and challenges aplenty, and can be a real challenge for the first go-around. Giant boulders, quick falling blocks, sinking platforms, insta-kill pits, and dangerous enemies abound. It's the most challenging platforming level thus far, though it's not very long, so it's not really that grueling. You'll get a break in a quick underwater segment, and as long as you keep swimming, you're gonna be just fine. Next comes the dreaded Clock Tower. Much like Castlevania, you have tiny bats flying everywhere as you platform from precarious heights, Though at least this game doesn't have knockback, but damage can add up fast, and one wrong jump can send you falling down, down, down. You won't die, but it'll be a long way back up. The music is perfectly tense, and while some of the imagination has since disappeared as it's not as colorful looking, the platforming and gameplay have become very solid, with a good, but fair challenge. It's the first time that I really struggled a bit in this game. Finally, you reach the guardian and boss of the clock tower. It's just a big guy, and he does happen to look a little bit like the giant from Mickey and the Beanstalk, even though he really isn't. Again, the boss isn't very tough and not very memorable, but once you complete that, it's time to fight Mizrabel with the power of the rainbow and get Minnie back. Here you can clearly see she is based off the Snow White Witch, though changed enough to not be her. Easily the most difficult and memorable boss, she arms herself with a ghost shield, and watching where she teleports and getting in just the right spot to give her a bonk in the head is key, but being off just a little bit can be a real problem. Plus, sometimes the ghost will send you up, up, up to your demise. Once you've managed to conquer a few times, success is had and you and Minnie are reunited. Now, where this pearl came from and how that makes the witch good and help you ride away from the fireworks is anyone's guess, but you get the kiss and you've won the game. Castle of Illusion is still a feast for the eyes, still has inventive moments, and is around just long enough to be satisfying without overstaying its welcome. While certainly other platformers before and after have done it better, there was something special about that moment when Mickey came to life in a game unlike anything he had ever been in before, and just how well it played. It was also a great early example of what Sega could do with the hardware, especially when made from the ground up, as opposed to the majority of games Sega put out at the time that were arcade ports. It has its own place among the platforming pantheons, and it's a legacy that the game will hold on to for years to come. There's something inherently different about the way I feel with Castle of Illusion compared to a lot of other Sega Genesis games, even some of my favorites like Sonic 2 and Gunstar Heroes. I'm nostalgic for all of them, but there's a certain sense of true childlike nostalgia that comes from Castle of Illusions, because of the way it made me interact with my mom, the way it brought back memories of other Disney things that I was in love with. There's something, a memory that invokes and a feeling that not a lot of other games could ever do for me. What's really interesting, though, is the rest of Castle of Illusion's legacy directly linked to that game. And it begins with the ports for 8-bit consoles in 1991. Castle of Illusion Castle of Illusion on Game Gear and the Sega Master System. What you'd be surprised is, there's a lot more going on than just a straight port for these. This version, while staying faithful to the music and the general themes and story of the game, is actually a completely unique experience. The game has more straightforward levels and platforming, but now Mickey can pick up objects and move them, leading to more puzzles than the Genesis version. Bosses are completely redesigned, or they're even brand new. In fact, the bosses here, well, not as hard, have more variety thanks to these new mechanics, and by virtue, are a little bit more memorable, though the stages aren't as good as the Genesis version, and of course the animation and graphics are not as fluid, though the 8-bit versions of the soundtrack are fantastic. However, all this aside, this is still an incredibly fun game in its own right, and is pretty much a great companion piece to its 16-bit counterpart. This is due in part to the shared members of the team from the Genesis version, as well as having a few of its own new members that are a bit more familiar with the 8-bit hardware. It's clear that a lot of care went into playing into the strengths of the system, without just straight porting the Genesis version to these consoles without care for what would be lost. A North American copy of Castle of Illusion for the Master System is very rare complete, but carts aren't too expensive when they pop up, and even then the console is region free, so you can always nail the PAL copy, which is significantly easier to find. The Game Gear version was released worldwide and is a much easier game to get a hold of, though it feels a lot better to play it on the Master System. But honestly, you should try to get any version you can because it's a fantastic experience that doesn't get brought up in nearly as much compared to its 16-bit counterpart. However, it would take 22 years for any kind of direct continuation of Castle of Illusion to be released. This game was the spiritual successor / tribute / sequel, Epic Mickey The Power of Illusion, released in 2012 on the Nintendo 3DS. While this game is a sequel to the original Castle of Illusion, it wasn't developed by anybody involved with the original game. nor was Sega involved with publishing the game in any respects. The game was developed by the company Dreamrift, who had previously made the game Monster Tale, and was published by Disney Interactive Studios as part of the Epic Mickey series, though it also fills in as a sequel to Castle of Illusion. This game was a cool tribute to the original Castle of Illusion and Disney as a whole, and fit in perfectly with the idea of the Epic Mickey series, as Mickey, and many people, had forgotten the castle and Mizrabel, and much like Oswald and so many others in the Epic Mickey series, ended up in the wasteland to be forgotten and live their life. However, now Mizrabel is sucking the paint away from popular characters to hopefully gain enough power to escape the wasteland. While the game is full of Disney fan service and some of the mechanics from the Illusion series like the bouncing is here, sadly the inventive levels, fun platforming, and fantastic music has been replaced with fetch quests and linear halls. The levels inspired by Disney movies look nice, but they don't really add too much. The game is relatively easy, and the paint thinner mechanic, while a cool idea, is too slow and cumbersome to really make the game flow well. Otherwise, a lot of the other stuff is serviceable, but given the pedigree of the original, it just doesn't match up. The game is very well-meaning, and it's clear there was love for the source material, but the game just doesn't capture the spirit of the original, and was generally in bargain bins and largely forgotten by 2013. However, that same year, news broke that Sega themselves would be doing an HD remake of Castle of Illusion. However, unlike many games of the time, this didn't mean a remastering or just redrawing the game with new graphics, but was a from-the-ground-up remake done by Sega Studios Australia. Once Creative Assembly Australia and developer of the medieval Total War games, Sega would put them on a couple of smaller projects, including the London 2012 Olympic Games, and the generally disliked Stormrise. However, they then made a prototype when Sega was shopping around a Castle of Illusion's remake, and presented it to the original designer, Emiko Yamamoto. She enjoyed it so much that Sega gave them the green light on the project, and was even able to work with many of the original staff members, as Emiko was now a producer at Disney Interactive who was partnering with Sega for this game. The remake was a very solid effort, and though the controls weren't as tight, and the graphics lost a bit of flourish from the transition from 2D to 3D, the game was actually really great, and did enough to reimagine the game while still keeping the best moments and the elements that made it truly special. On top of that, the soundtrack was given a phenomenal update by Grant Kirkhope, composer for many classic Rare games. The game made the castle fully explorable, added fun collectibles to unlock costumes for Mickey, as well as opened new areas by collecting gems. It also made the stages a little more interesting, though it still kept the general spirit. In that same regard, it also made the bosses slightly more interesting. They are generally the same, but added a few new things to make the fights a little more interesting and challenging, though some bosses are much more redesigned and made far better. They even managed to explain the ending better, which I kind of enjoyed, since at least now I know what the Pearl does. The narrator and cutscenes also really added an extra piece that made it feel all the more like a real Disney cartoon come to life.
Ominous and terrifying, the castle stood out against the skyline like a shadow from a horrible nightmare.
Even though the game was only a few hours long, it was great fun and was worthy of the name, giving it enough new to make it feel like a different experience, but still kept enough of the classic elements to make them all fit into a cohesive package that made it really feel like something worthy of the Castle of Illusion name. The sad news was that this game would end up being Sega Studio Australia's swan song, as they soon closed after the release of the game, but at least they went out strong. But who knows what else they could have done after this game. Sadder still, this game is just about to be delisted as of this video, and outside of unused Steam, Xbox Live, and PlayStation Network codes, the game's gonna be lost to time for a lot of people who want to play this later on. Castle of Illusion's legacy is fantastic, and for many, including myself, it's the quintessential Disney Sega game, even over stuff like Lion King and Aladdin. However, Castle of Illusion is only one game, and the Evolution series is way bigger than just one game. And though many of the other games never directly were sequels to that, there were plenty more that invoked the spirit and feelings. And next time, we're going to cover the rest of the ones directly following Mickey. That includes the Game Gear sequels, or spiritual successors, and the quasi-official sequel for the Sega Genesis. Till next time. Thanks again for watching, guys, and as always, if you want to watch some other videos, you can click the one on the left, or if the next episode of The Wonderful World of Sega and Disney's out, you can click the video on the right to check the next one out.